Hi, we are going to start now the last session, which is devoted to the digital humanities and open access. For those who don't know me, I'm Asher Reagan. I oversee academic programs at Yad Nadiv at the Rothschild Foundation in Israel, and I'll introduce our speakers, one of whom you know quite well. It's Ted Hewitt, who's been with us since the beginning, president of SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council in Canada. And joining us online from the US is Brett Bobley. Brett is the Chief Information Officer for the National Endowment for the Humanities, and he also directs the Office of Digital Humanities, which has been central in supporting digital humanities projects in America and quite active in international collaborations, including with Canada, the UK, Germany, and I think many other initiatives. Brett, can you hear us?
Brett, can you hear us?
Brett?
Yep, I got you. I can hear you.
Okay, thanks, Brett. Thanks for being with us.
Of course.
So we'll start with a joint presentation of both Ted and Brett, and then questions following that.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. So this is going to be a real test of my ability to coordinate a transatlantic connection, an eye, left-hand, right-hand connection, and some other things I'm hearing about that I didn't know about before. What's
closer to the mic?
this mic? This mic? Okay. So good luck to me is all I can say. So we're going to start, this is a bifurcated presentation on things that are somewhat linked in terms of open access and issues related to open access. I will be speaking primarily from the Canadian experience and some of the issues that we've been having with the humanities community in terms of both challenges and opportunities. And then I'm going to turn over to Brett, and I'm going to turn his slides while he talks. And then when we're done, we're going to put Brett up on the screen so you can see him in his office in Washington, and then we'll hopefully be able to engage in the discussion. Okay? So I'm going to step away now to move to the first slide. And apparently, we're on PDF. So, do I need to ask this question? But I will anyway, just for clarification in terms of the way we understand open access as the practice of providing free and unrestricted primarily online access to research publications and data. And in terms of some of the additional terminology, we talk usually in terms of green versus gold access. And I know for some of you this is going to be secondhand, but just in terms of making sure we're all at the same level for the discussion. The idea that green open access really involves depositing typically without charge publications in repositories or in other locations where they can be found with relative ease, and gold referring primarily to the act of or the practice of authors publishing their articles in open access journals, where they're then made freely available, but usually subject to some charge or other, sometimes known as an APC or an article processing charge. So you can go green or you can go gold, or in fact you can do both, as I'll explain, as what we did in Canada and in other places. So framing the discussion, and I think this is important in with respect to how we understand this from a humanities perspective, is why we do this. Most of the researchers that I talk to in Canada believe that it's just another torture mechanism invented by the granting councils just to irritate researchers and to and to force them to do more and more things for less and less return. As we explain, and certainly in the Canadian context, we're actually a bit behind the rest of the world, and we're very keen to be with our partners elsewhere. And then, of course, for all the good reasons, we can talk about open access is very important. It's a great. On the one hand, people talk about publicly funded research and the responsibility of those who receive public funding to disseminate their findings in a broad and public fashion. We can talk about our responsibility to ensure that our work gets distributed to as many people as possible in a broader sense, and provides that opportunity. Also, with respect to the research process itself, that we're able to share information more readily and more quickly, and we're able to reach much larger audiences. And I don't think I need to go through every reason. I'll talk a little bit more specifically about open access in the humanities context, but in general, I think there's broad acceptability for the benefits of an open access regime. I'm not quite sure what that is. Now, No? Brad, are you still there? Brad, are you still there? Okay, we'll get him back later.
Sorry, I'm here.
Okay, good.
I have my microphone muted.
Oh, okay, we're just checking because we're just flipping through the slides. Can you see the slides pretty well?
I can, thank you.
Okay, good. Now, so like Anne-Marie, we've done a bit of a summary of who does what where in the world, and you know, if we haven't got this completely right, I'm sure you're going to tell me later in the discussion, but it's just a sample of what policies are in place where. So for example, with respect to Brazil, which is maintaining a green policy along with the US and Mexico, versus other countries which have mixed policies. So in Europe you have some green, you have some gold, notably gold in Netherlands and the UK. Just as a comparison of where things are at in different parts of the planet. China and India we've included as well, and everyone there is green. So in terms of where we landed in Canada, we opted to do two things. One was to develop a policy that would cover all of our funding agencies, all of our federal funding agencies, and some of the provincial ones who've joined in with us. But our agency, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research all agreed that we would have one policy and that this one policy would be put in place at the same time, and that was actually May 15, 2015. The other thing that we did, which was a purely Canadian compromise, is that we said we'd go both green and gold. And so we would allow, in fact, gold solutions. If researchers were willing to pay, we would fund those article processing fees. And if they didn't, then we said, it's okay, you can publish what we called sort of penultimate peer-reviewed version of the article on any repository that you would like. There are a number already in existence in Canada. Some of them are maintained by associations, some by universities, some by organizations that are dedicated to open access per se, and that would be perfectly okay. That does create some challenges I'm sure we can talk about a little bit later, particularly when journals aren't very happy about that practice and then what you do about that. So I'll come back to that. Here we go, and there's the policy itself. So we've advertised for some time now. Online repositories are fine as the green route of whatever kind, as long as publications are available. You must do this within 12 months of publication, or at 12 months of publication. And for journals, you can either publish in a journal that offers immediate open access, or one that will agree to do so within 12 months. And as I said before, that may incur a charge. These are not mutually exclusive. You can do one, the other, or you can do both, and that's perfectly okay. And here are the conditions, as I said before, as of, I think I said May 15, May 1, 2015 and onward. It doesn't apply to student scholarships or bursaries. It doesn't apply to monographs as well at this point. And I guess it's an important third bullet as well, that we've said, you know, this isn't to be the law so much as this is a guideline to encourage good behavior. It's a guideline to encourage good scholarship, and that we expect researchers to do this. We're not going after them to chase them down to make sure that they've done it. Obviously, they'll have to indicate that when they apply in their CVs. Very interesting study that was done by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. They've had a policy, in fact, on open access for quite a while. The other agencies simply, in effect, joined on board with CIHR in developing the 3-council policy. They did their own study last year, and they found that their compliance rate for open access was about 80%. Now, you know, we could have taken two attitudes to that, and in Canada we said 80%, that's pretty good. Like, we think that's great because we're trying to encourage good behavior. We didn't say we've got to track down those 20% and find out why they didn't do that. That this is not acceptable. So I think we took the right attitude, we're taking the right approach, and we're working with researchers to find ways to make this happen and to identify roadblocks that they may confront and work with them to get through those roadblocks. Okay, so what are we hearing from researchers in the humanities about this process? And we are hearing. And we're also hearing from the journals and from the scholarly associations who manage the journals, particularly in the humanities. One of the challenges has to do with the so-called article half-life. So, many humanities papers accrue half of their total number of readers within 40 to 50 months. So that's well beyond the embargo period. And what the journals are saying and researchers are saying is, like, people don't access these things, right away. There's a possibility that, people will just wait until things are free, and then they'll access them for free, and this is going to kill the scholarly journals. And, I've always said, I don't think people wait. First of all, they can just go to the library. But secondly, I don't think people would actually wait until an embargo period is over to get access to an article for free just because it's free. That doesn't make any sense to me. But the journals maintain quite strongly that this 12-month embargo period was too short. It should be much longer than that. On the other hand, other people argue that it should be 6 months, and in some cases, in some countries, it is 6 months. So it's an ongoing discussion. We're funding a study right now with an organization in the province of Quebec called Erudit, where we're actually consulting with many of the scholarly publishers to try and figure out what the economic impact of open access will be on them, to talk about some ways that we can use to mitigate this problem. Copyright permissions, we've heard that permissions to use copyrighted materials in open access papers can be difficult. You could understand why in some cases. And I think we have to take this at face value and see if there are complaints or there are issues, or if in fact this does obtain, and we'll know as the policy starts to move forward. Thirdly, Monograph Publishing, open access right now in Canada does not apply to monographs. That books are still can be published and they can be sold, and that material does not have to be made available other than through the library. On the other side of the coin, we're saying and we're hearing that there are a number of opportunities with respect to open access and some of these things I've mentioned. For researchers with limited access to journals for whatever reason, rare volumes, journals that may not be subscribed to by specific libraries. Now some of this material will be made available online, a little bit easier to get to. On the other side of that coin, the work of individuals that's published now in journals should potentially have a much wider audience. And this is something we're trying to emphasize, and we're hearing from some researchers that potentially, at least, they're gonna be able to publish much further afield than might have occurred. This issue with respect to the monograph crisis, I suppose, to the extent that libraries are able to save some money in their negotiation with publishers, or their ability now to use materials that are open access and thereby obtained for free, this may free up money to buy hard copy printed monograph material. Potentially. It also provides an opportunity for the journals, as I was saying before, to think about a forced opportunity, I agree, but an opportunity nonetheless to think about their models of publication in print form and whether or not they might be able to move to an online format, which could involve considerable cost savings. And I think that's where I'm going to stop. So I'm looking forward to the discussion and some of the practices at some of the other agencies. I know there are a number of concerns still outstanding. I mean, we have conversations on this topic nearly daily in our office, so I'm sure it'll engender some lively conversation. So Brett,
Yeah.
I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to move the slide when you say, can you change the slide? Does that work?
Well, that works for me. Thank you very much, Ted. And can everybody hear me okay?
Good. That's great.
All right, terrific. Well, thank you very much. I apologize that no one from the NEH could make it in person. This is the week of the U.S. Thanksgiving holiday, and I think most of my colleagues have already left town. So, but hello to everybody there. Hello to Asher, who I just saw walk by a minute ago. Hello. So Ted, yeah, go ahead. Let's go to the next slide.
Oh, yay. Tell me if I'm doing it right. Okay.
Looking good. Ted asked me to give everybody kind of an overview of digital humanities, some of the things that we're working on here at the NEH. So I thought I'd start off with the obligatory definitional slide. Here at the NEH, we consider digital humanities to be very much an umbrella term that designates a variety of different kinds of activities. And I think it's an important point. And I'll try to show you a few examples of projects that we fund here in my office, the Office of Digital Humanities, that involve technology and the humanities in one fashion or another. We feel that technology has had a really fundamental impact on the way humanities scholars do their research. If you think about it, the things that humanists traditionally study, right? Humanists study books, they study music, they study art, they study newspapers. The materials that humanities scholars traditionally study are the very materials that are now being digitized at a mass scale. And it really does change in a fundamental fashion how people do their research, how they publish their research, how they search and look things up, and how the public gains access to those materials. So we really felt that having an Office of Digital Humanities allows us to kind of stay on the cutting edge and focus on the ways in which technology intersects with the humanities. Next slide, please.
Okay. You'll notice, Brett, that it's still on the SHRC template.
Not anymore.
There we go. Okay.
All right, so here's one example of a typical digital humanities project. This particular example is in the category of developing new methods for research. So this is one thing we do in my office, is we fund researchers who aren't necessarily doing research in the humanities, but are perhaps doing technology-based research to develop new ways of doing humanities research. This example here, you probably are familiar with the famous explorer David Livingstone. And Livingstone created a very famous diary, a field diary, in 1871. And if you look at it on the left, you can see that the field diary is almost completely unreadable. Livingstone had run out of regular paper to write on anymore. So he took old newspapers and he cut up the newspapers and turned them sideways. And then he wrote on top of the newspaper. He then later ran out of regular ink, so he started using berry juice as an ink. But what happened is all the ink faded, and as you can see, his diary is completely unreadable. And in fact, since 1871, historians have been dying to read this diary because it was locked up in a library and nobody could read it. We funded a project to a group of scholars and scientists who are developing new multispectral imaging techniques. And what they do is they beam different spectra of light at the original diary until they can get the berry juice ink to fluoresce. And as you can see on the right, they were successfully able to raise Livingstone's writing up so that now for the first time ever, historians can read David Livingstone's diary. And it's been actually quite fascinating because not only have they developed a new method that can now be used for other kinds of research, but the Livingstone historians have been very excited because they've learned a lot about Livingstone. In fact, they learned that when he finally made it out of Africa back to England, he really revised a lot of the things that he wrote in his original diary. So he's gained a lot of new insight into Livingstone's studies. So again, this is the idea of developing new technology methods. Next slide, please.
Yep. Uh-oh. That was an accident.
Well, the next page button might take you directly to the next one.
Dang. No, it's okay. I'm getting technical assistance here. There we go. Thanks. It was quite complex.
Okay, so I mentioned earlier that one thing we do is research into new methods, but of course we also do research, just traditional humanities research, but that leverages technology in one way or another. In this example here, John Donne did a very famous speech in 1622, his Gunpowder Day sermon. And scholars of John Donne have often wondered who exactly could hear Donne's famous sermon. In other words, we know that there were thousands of people assembled there, but just from a purely acoustic perspective, who could actually hear what Donne was saying, and how might he have delivered that speech? So in this particular project we're talking about, a group of historians and literature professors got together with some acoustic engineers, and they created a virtual recreation of the actual area where John Donne did this is in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. They actually recreated the acoustics of St. Paul's Cathedral, and then they hired an actor to read Donne's speech, and they actually were able to figure out acoustically who could hear the speech, what the echoes were like. They were able to figure out who could hear it, who could not. They were able to figure out the cadence of Donne's speech, because based on how echoey the area was, they could determine when Donne would have had to pause in order for the echo to fade. So again, this is an area where traditional John Donne scholars have really learned a lot more about John Donne than ever before by leveraging technology to help them do their more traditional research. Next slide, please. Okay. We also do a lot of funding in scholarly communications, as well as building scholarly libraries and archives. I mentioned earlier that we are massively digitizing materials all around the world, and in most cases making these materials available open access. This particular project is one that is co-funded between the NEH and the DFG in Germany, and it is called the Hellespont Project, and is bringing together one of the largest digital collections of classics materials in the US with one of the largest collections in Europe to bring in an integrated collection so that scholars and the public, when they're looking up, for example, a particular document, can see links to other documents that are related to it. Today, the classics world is a very much an open access world. The vast majority of classics materials have been digitized and made available, and projects like this are widely used by scholars and students around the world. It's really changed the way classic studies are done. Next slide, please. And my last example involves training. Another thing that we fund in my office are summer institutes and training institutes to try to help scholars learn the newest ways to take advantage of digital technology and new digital methods for research. This particular one is a summer institute that was at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, and was also was organized in part by IPAM, the Institute for Pure and Applied Mathematics. And it was a group of humanities scholars and mathematicians working together to take network analysis techniques that are used largely in mathematics and apply them to the humanities. And this was a 3-week, very in-depth institute. And the scholars were learning how to take network analysis techniques and apply them to their work. So for example, scholars in Danish studies were learning how Danish folklore could be studied by studying the network of people who exchanged folklore information with one another. We had literature professors, we had historians, all learning how they could take network analysis techniques and apply them to humanities research. And it's interesting, this particular institute was very successful. Many of the humanities professors who attended sent me letters afterward telling me that it completely changed the way they approach the humanities. And many of them have gone on to do some amazing research using these mathematical techniques they learned at this summer institute. So we've been funding a lot of these institutes to really help people who are expert in a new method train others so they can use it as well, because a lot of this is very new, and a lot of humanities professors in graduate school did not learn any of these digital humanities based methods. So we're really trying to get the word out. Next slide, please.
I'm getting the rhythm of this.
Okay, so I've completed that. That's my my brief overview of the types of projects that we typically fund in my office, the Office of Digital Humanities. And Ted also asked me to talk a little bit about our grant program, the Digging into Data Challenge, which, as many of you know, will shortly be coming under the umbrella of TAP, the Transatlantic Platform. But let me tell you a little bit about this grant program, and then we'll kind of talk about how it is becoming this much larger international program. Next slide, please. So the idea behind the Digging into Data Challenge is to address this notion of scale in the humanities and social sciences, kind of this big data idea. But roughly what it gets to is this notion that now that we have digitized millions and millions and millions of pages of digital books and digital music and digital newspapers, etc., how does that change the way in which we do research? For example, if you're a historian and you used to do your research by going to the library and reading a few books or reading some newspapers, but you now have access to millions of newspapers, how does that fundamentally change the way you do your work? That's what Digging into Data Challenge is all about. It's really funding exemplar research at the large scale that demonstrates how scale changes the way you do your research. Next slide. So this grant program has been around since 2009. We have completed 3 rounds of funding in 2009, in 2011, and 2013. Next slide. This is an international grant program, and in our previous round, the one in 2013, these are the different international funding organizations that co-sponsored the Digging into Data Challenge. As you can see, we have SSHRC and a number of other Canadian agencies. Here in the US, we have, in addition to the NEH, we have the National Science Foundation and the IMLS. We also have organizations in the UK, obviously, as you can see, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the ESRC as well, and JISC. And in the Netherlands, we have the NWO. So we had 4 different countries altogether, Canada, US, Netherlands, and UK, co-funding the Digging into Data Challenge in our previous round. Next slide, please. One thing we've been very pleased about with this grant program is it really captured the imagination of the popular press. We have received a great deal of press coverage for various projects funded under the Digging into Data Challenge. As you can see, in things like the New York Times and the BBC, the Globe and Mail, a lot of newspaper coverage, which is indicative of the fact that the general public is really quite excited about how we are leveraging technology to study the humanities in new and fascinating ways. Next slide, please. We've also been pleased with how interdisciplinary these projects have been. Not only disciplines across the humanities and social sciences, but a lot of other disciplines as well, particularly in the computer and information science areas, have been working together to do these projects. We really see technology as very much a bridge, an interdisciplinary bridge, to help bring other disciplines into the humanities and social sciences. Next slide. So I thought I would just mention a handful of the research projects that we have funded in this grant program. This one, the Impact Radiological Mummy Database, is one that received an enormous amount of coverage in newspapers all around the world, in large part because they had an interesting sort of breakthrough discovery about the fact that a lot of ancient mummies died of heart disease. That was kind of a big deal. I think a lot of people have always assumed that heart disease is a modern affliction, that only people who eat modern diets, lots of cheeseburgers and such, would get heart disease. But in fact, many mummies from different parts of the world died of heart disease. This particular project brought together anthropologists working with cardiologists. So it's an interesting medical humanities project that really captured a lot of people's imagination. Next slide, please. But to show you the wide variety of projects, we went from anthropology. This is a project in poetry. This one brought together a group of poets with computer scientists who are actually designing ways to read and analyze poetry using computer technology. And it was a very interesting interdisciplinary project. This quotation you see here from Kate Coles, she's a professor of the University of Utah, and she talked about how complex and how difficult it was working with the computer scientists, but that in the end, it was very beneficial to her work studying poetry. She thought the computer scientists brought a very different perspective to how you train a computer to understand poetry and meter. And in a lot of ways, she and the computer scientists both felt that they learned a lot working together on this project, which, by the way, has been ongoing. Even since this original grant, they have been continuing to work together on some other fascinating projects that bridge computer science and poetry. Next slide, please. We've also funded a number of projects in digging into data in the field of language and linguistics. This particular one that was covered in the Telegraph is about linguistics researchers who are using data from Twitter, other online social networks, to try to hunt for what are the next popular words. For example, a word like selfie that didn't exist a couple years ago that is now an extremely popular word. By actually searching for words at the very low scale, they're able to actually find words before they become popular and predict which ones will become popular in the future. And also figure out, for example, regional variations, which words are popular in different parts of the world. It's an interesting new way of studying linguistics. Next slide. And one last example is music research. Been working with a lot of computational musicologists, people who study music using computer technology at the large scale. This is the Elvis Project, which is the first large data-driven research project on musical style. They're actually trying to learn about how musical style evolves over time by studying thousands and thousands of pieces of music computationally, by doing research that an individual music scholar couldn't do, but a computer can help the scholars do. So just to show you just a wide variety of different humanities and social science projects taking advantage of technology. Next slide, please. We've been very pleased with also the scholarly reception to the Digging into Data Challenge. For example, the IEEE has an annual conference called the International Conference on Big Data. And they do have a special workshop called Big Humanities that focuses on big data and the humanities. And last year, of the 16 papers accepted into the conference, 7 of them were digging into data projects. So as you can see, when it comes to big data and the humanities, the Digging into Data Challenge is an essential part and has been funding a large percentage of the research going on around the world. Next slide, please. So we're very pleased to say that the 4th round of Digging into Data Challenge is being sponsored by TAP, the Transatlantic Platform. So it is going to greatly increase in scale. I mentioned before that in previous rounds we had 4 countries participating. In the next upcoming round 4, we will have 11 countries participating. So that is a huge increase in participating countries, and there'll be 16 different funding organizations working from those 11 nations on 3 different continents. So we will have people from North America, South America, and of course Europe. And we're really looking forward to seeing what new collaborations come into being. One change we'll be making with the program is that all of the teams that apply must have a transatlantic collaboration, meaning that every team that applies must have at least 1 country from Europe and 1 country from North America or South America. But it's completely up to the researchers to form these teams. Some may have teams involving 2 countries, 3 countries, 7 countries. We're going to leave it up to the research community to figure out exciting new projects, research projects that they can do together involving scholars from all around the world. And one last slide. Just to show you our timeline quickly, back in January of 2015, the Transatlantic Platform convened a 2-day conference where we brought together an international group of scholars to help us brainstorm on what this 4th round of Digging into Data might look like. So we very much wanted to take in the opinions of the field to figure out what will work best for them. Then in June, TAP Steering Committee met in Ottawa, and we first began discussing a draft RFP for this new program. In the fall 2015, right now, we are working very hard to finalize this RFP. As Ted knows, I've been working with his staff and the 10 other countries putting together the RFP. And needless to say, it's a lot of work to put together an RFP with 11 different countries. There's a lot of lawyers involved, a lot of there's a lot of work to figure out all the different drafts and get all the rules and regulations in place. But we're actually very close to being completed. And we hope to announce this new grant program in early 2016. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
That's awesome. Thanks. See if we can get Brett up on screen so you can see him where he's at, and then I'm gonna. Okay, do you think it would be great if he could sort of see everybody? Oops, I got the ceiling. That's good. That's pretty good.
All right.
It's a good crowd. Don't worry. Okay, so talk to the mic. All right, so we are now ready to engage in the discussion. There'll be lots of questions and comments, concerns, and maybe I'll turn to my colleagues first at the other councils to get a sense of where we're at these days with open access and concerns and opportunities for humanities research and or big data. Okay, you guys are okay? Or maybe I just want to check in with my colleagues first. So, Rick?
I need a microphone.
Yeah, and if you have a question for Brett, I will relay just in case he can't hear it.
Hi, Brett. It's Rick Rylands here from the HRC.
Hi there, Rick.
My question is, if this is the future, what are the biggest obstacles from your point of view in terms of developing digital humanities? You've told us loads of success stories. Where are the problems?
I mean, the problems in terms of developing our digital humanities program, I mean, obviously the biggest one was funding. We still are struggling with budget every single day. But I think we've been pleased with how the community has responded. I think when we first began doing this, we had to overcome some concerns from, with money being so tight. If we're funding stuff in digital humanities, what are we taking money away from, right? But I think the case we've had to make is that we're not funding digital humanities in lieu of humanities. This is the humanities. The projects that we're funding are in the humanities, or they advance the humanities. They're simply taking advantage of the fact that we're in the year 2015. We have the internet, and scholars from around the world are going to be utilizing these materials on the internet. And we need to be cognizant of that. So I wouldn't say that other than money, we haven't really run into any major obstacles. I think that if I had to say the biggest problem that we're dealing with right now, I would say it's probably sustainability of digital projects in the long term. If you think about a traditional humanities project, for example, you give money to a researcher. They write a monograph. When they're done with the monograph, they hand the monograph to the library, and the library sustains that monograph forever. So in a sense, the scholar can wash their hands of it and say, well, I can move on to another project. But imagine if a scholar, instead of creating a paper monograph, they create a digital database of some sort. Well, that digital database has to be maintained. It can't just be on its own. So who is going to pay to maintain a digital resource for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years? It's a very different way of funding. And grants are not a great mechanism for funding things that need to be funded for the long term, right? Grants tend to run out after 2 or 3 years. So if you think of a project like I mentioned earlier, the Perseus Project, which is this digital library that is used in the classics. Now that's been around for 20 years or so, and it is absolutely essential. Everyone in the classics uses it. But who pays for that? How is it maintained over years? Now, luckily, the Perseus people have managed to get by getting grants here and there all over the place. But I think it's important that we work with universities who begin to understand that maintaining digital scholarship is very much in the same area as maintaining a library. Just as universities invest in their library to sustain scholarship for the long term, they should also be investing in sustaining digital scholarship for the long term. So to answer your question, Rick, I think sustainability is one of the major hurdles that we have encountered and still think we need to get over.
And I think from our perspective as well, there is a sense, within the community that we now, the funding council, particularly our council, which is social science humanities, think that all humanities is now digital humanities. And I get reminded this every day, not all humanities is digital humanities, Go, yes, I know that, that's true. On the other side, on the flip side, it really puts the lie, to some extent, to the cost of research argument, which we hear about a lot. That science is expensive. Well, science equipment is expensive, but the cost of doing research is now evening out, I think, across the disciplines if you take away the equipment. If you have graduate students, access to computation, et cetera, and so forth. And we've invested, millions and millions of dollars. Just SSHRC's invested millions of dollars in digital humanities, and I think that is actually a very positive thing in terms of saying to government, we're not cheap researchers. We don't need as much money as you do. Anyway.
I think you make a good point, Ted. I think also collaborative research, as you suggested, is much more expensive. In other words, once you start adding 2 or 3 people working together with graduate students, the price goes way up, even if you're not using a computer.
Exactly.
And I think that we all see that interdisciplinary and collaborative research is the future, but it is more expensive than the individual solo scholarship that you think of the humanities being 20 or 30 or 100 years ago.
That's a great point, Brett, and really helps, it adds to some of the previous points that were made today during the course of the discussion. So maybe one more and then we'll open it up. So go ahead.
Yes, congratulations, Brett. I fully agree with whatever I've said. And I think people are afraid that if we talk about digital humanities and humanities, we talk of 2 really different fields of research. And you made the point also, Ted, saying, well, it's a frame, it's an umbrella. And we would be stupid in humanities not using the new technologies for our research, because it will help us to ask questions we haven't been able to ask before. Now, concerning sustainability, it's exactly what we have also allocated as a problem. And I'll give you some example, or one example I'd just like to mention. We have figured out in archaeology. We have had a couple of meetings concerning the problem of the variety of data we are collecting in archaeology. It's not only a manuscript being digitized, it's coming data from paleobotany, anthropology, from geography, from medicine, whatsoever, yeah? And for a couple of years now we are financing the build-up of a center at the German Archaeological Institute called Janus. It's supposed to be a big center of helping people to collect data and store that data there, but also being a point of center from where you can have probably access to other data stored at different places. It's a quite complicated thing. It involves lawyers, law, and whatsoever, but we see it as a future. And we see it also well established with the DIE. It's an institution there for 170 years. We have had a similar project before at a university institution, at an archaeological institute. It failed because there was no commitment really properly by the university Data Information Center to say, well, we keep it up for the next 10, 15, 20 years. And only then it's really good to invest if you know that you have the insurance of an institution to keep it up for a considerable amount of time. Thank you.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. We the exact same issues we're working with here, and I do think that international groups like the meeting that we're having today are good opportunities to talk about how the international community can work together on these sort of data preservation and sustainability issues. Archaeology is a perfect example. I mean, it's a very obviously a very international endeavor. And of course, with archaeology, once you've dug it out of the ground, you can never dig it out again. So it's particularly important that we sustain that data that comes out of the ground so that other archaeologists can use it in years to come.
We like your poster. It's very cool. Did you want to go ahead, just taking order of questions, I think. Yeah. We're just getting the microphone, Brett.
Hello, Brett. This is Signai here. I was wondering about the big data title, because this is a term that came from the other sciences and relates to computation force and often in the digital humanities, people talk about big-ish data, because it's not as big as to answer like the strict definition maybe, or one of the strict definitions. Is that something that you take into consideration? Did you have discussions about how big the data should be, and your criteria about it?
Yes, we have indeed. There is a great quotation from there's a scholar at Johns Hopkins University who you may know him. Saeed Chowdhury is his name, and he has a great quotation about what makes data big. And this is his definition. He said that in any given discipline, if you have so much data that you need to build new methods to analyze that data, that's big data. What that means is that, so for example, in the humanities, if you might only have 1,000 books, but for you, that might be big data because you now need to build new methods for analyzing 100 books. Whereas in physics, it might be 1 billion something in order for it to be truly big. So the way we're looking at it is that we're not worrying too much about defining what the number is to make it big. But if you're at a scale where computational methods are helping you do the research in some way you couldn't do before, that's big. That's scaled up data, and that's fine. So we're not worrying about a minimal threshold or anything like that.
Malka.
Hi, I'd like to ask two questions. One is, do you have any challenges in terms of the evaluation process, given the relative newness of the discipline and the interdisciplinarity of the efforts? How do you compose your evaluation panels, and do you have anything to say in general about the evaluation process? That's one question. The other question has to do with, you said that one of your challenges is getting funding. And so I'm wondering whether the NEH in general has, I don't know how the NEH is completely governed, but is it a constant struggle between your division in the NEH and the board of the overseeing board of the NEH? And do you find that you're able to partner with other disciplines in order to get more funding for digital humanities?
Okay, those are great questions. Peer review is challenging in my office. I would say, and my over the last 10 years or so, my staff has put together an amazing and pretty remarkable database of people that do digital humanities work of all kind around the country and around the world that we call on to help us do our peer review. I think that typically we do very interdisciplinary peer review. So for example, I actually have a peer review panel later today, and if I look around the table at the 5 panelists we're bringing in, I think I have like an archaeologist, I have a historian, I have a computer scientist, I have a librarian. I have people from lots of different disciplines together to help us adjudicate these applications. Because again, as you said, it is a challenge. What we'll do when we get in a large group of applications, we will divide them with like-minded applications, and then put them on panels where we bring together a group of interdisciplinary scholars who can bring the different perspectives to bear. And I have to say, on the whole, it's worked quite well. It is a challenge to bring together the right people, but on the whole, it has worked well. And I should note, by the way, if any of you are ever looking to form a panel and you need people with digital humanities skills, feel free to shoot me an email. We have a large database of people that do this kind of work, and we'd be happy to share names with you if that is at all helpful.
It was one of the benefits as well, I think, Brett, of the digging into data process is that over the years and over the course of this competition, people were applying and we were learning who they were and where they were doing. We might not otherwise have known. So that was a real accelerator in an area you could call higher risk research that didn't really fit the traditional mold. So it was a great success from that perspective.
And I think your other question was about funding here at the NEH and in the United States in general. The major issue is, to be perfectly blunt, the NEH has a very small budget. We have last year our budget, our total agency budget was about 140 million US, and of the 140 million, about less than 100 million actually goes to grants, to research. And of that 100 million, about 40 million goes out to every state in the United States has a local humanities organization. So about 40% of the money goes directly to them. And they usually use that for local state-based humanities programs, like, for example, reading programs at libraries and things like that. So actually, only about $60 million goes to actual humanities research. And considering that the United States is a very large country, that's not a lot of money. It's $60 million for research in the humanities is pretty modest for a country of the size of the United States. I suspect many of you have larger budgets than we do, even though you might be a smaller country than we are. So it's very frustrating. We're always fighting with the U.S. Congress to try to get more money for humanities research, but as you can imagine, in the current political environment, that's not always easy to do. So the budget that I have for my digital humanities program is just a very modest piece of that money. Our budget right now is a little bit over $4 million per year. So it's pretty modest.
But I think that also speaks to the importance of partnership and the transatlantic platform model, which,
Yeah.
By the time you put together 11 countries and 16 funding agencies, a few dollars go a long, long, long way.
But are you able to get money from other funding agencies, from other disciplines? In other words, if digital humanities is in some sense inherently interdisciplinary, so from computational, from funding agencies that fund computational projects, are you able to get funding from those sources?
Yes, I mean, as Ted just suggested, to be honest with you, one of the reasons we do a lot of these international grant programs is it enables us to pool our money with other funders. On that first slide, you may have noted that in the Digging Into Data Challenge, there are 2 other American funding agencies as well. There's the National Science Foundation, and there's also the Institute for Museum and Library Services. So they fund a lot of library science and information science. So by working with those 2 other American funders, we're able to make sure that the American pot is much larger than I could fund by myself. But the nice thing about the Digging Into Data Challenge and the other international programs we've done, I mean, for example, we also have a digital humanities program with the DFG we've funded over the years, is it enables us to fund research projects that we could not afford to fund by ourselves. So it enables us to stretch those dollars in a big way.
Okay. Sir.
I want to go back to the sustainability issue, which you raise as a major challenge. And you made the analogy to universities investing in libraries in the same way they're going to have to invest in sustaining digital products of research. But the problem is often, if we take the example of the Perseus digital libraries, that it's not a resource that belongs to one institution, it belongs to a community of scholars. And then it's more difficult to get a particular institution to foot the bill for that and to assume the long-term costs. So are there any thoughts in terms of strategies to make this work through whatever frameworks or funding agencies or community, sort of research communities, or pay for access models that I know some projects have gone in that direction?
Brett, do you want to start with that? I could say a couple of words. But.
Sure. I mean, I would say it's a really tough question. There are some communities that have been working together to, and I think archaeology is a good example. I know that not only the DAI in Germany, but organizations like Open Context here in the U.S. have been trying to be kind of pan-disciplinary digital repositories that are centrally funded and can support many different projects. But in other disciplines, it's much more difficult. I mean, to give you an example, here's a good one. I just showed you a few moments ago that John Donne project. They have built this amazing digital reproduction of St. Paul's Cathedral, which can be used for research. But in 3 or 4 or 5 years, the technology behind that virtual reconstruction will be out of date. And my guess is that the researchers will have moved on to other things. And chances are that technology will just sort of die away. Who would fund something like that to maintain it in the future? Now that doesn't mean, by the way, that all technology-based projects should be maintained forever. There are many instances where you develop technology for a short-term research project, and that's just fine. But on the other hand, if you're developing infrastructure which is designed to be shared, how can you support that? And what are ways in which I really think that the funders need to work together and the university community needs to work together to ensure methods for maintaining this stuff. It's not that sustainability is a new issue. We've been sustaining scholarship for thousands of years. It's just in a different format. The libraries that we have today are still largely designed for sustaining paper objects. I think in the future we need to work on an international library system that can also sustain digital objects.
And I think that's what's happening in Canada, at least. There's not one solution. There are multiple solutions, and in some cases, institutions themselves have developed repositories that they're maintaining for all the work that gets done through there. There are associations like Scholars Portal in the province of Ontario. They're maintaining all this data. National organizations, Compute Canada, even the network, Canary, so-called, is our fiber optic network. I mean, they're looking at storage options. So it's going to be a multifaceted solution. Question we might ask, and we haven't discussed this, is private sector is chomping at the bit. IBM, would love to get into the business. They're already involved in high performance computing in Canada with a project called SOCIP. Don't ask me to spell it out because I can't remember. But in terms of the computing capacity and the storage capacity of the private sector, it outstrips anything we would have in public, let's call it, in academia by 1,000 times. And they would love to get their hands on data, and they'll repackage it and sell it, or access to it. So I think we're into some pretty interesting territory here. Yeah, right.
I'm conscious we haven't talked about open access, but I'm not going to talk about open
problematic,
access.
so we're good.
It's just an observation. The controversy around Google and the Library of Congress, of course, is relevant to all of that. My question really is about skills. I mean, you mentioned a very imaginative initiative, the one you described earlier on, but it's more typically the situation, at least in the UK, that there are one or two enthusiasts in a humanities department who are very keen on this, but they live a somewhat separate life to the rest of the department. So how does one try and develop a more activist profile for digital skills?
Brad, I'll pass that to you.
Okay, sure. We have found, in terms of digital skills, I think you're absolutely right. There typically seems to be, in any given university department, there might be one or two people who are really interested in developing new digital skills, and they're kind of the leaders in their area. But what we have found, I mentioned earlier, we're doing these summer institutes, these training programs. We have found them to be really, really popular. One of the things we try to do is these are not training institutes just for like-minded digital scholars. The idea here is that digital scholars train mainstream scholars on how to do this kind of work. I'll give you an example of one we did recently that was really great. I was contacted recently by a military historian, and she told me a very interesting story. She said, in military history, they have a fantastic amount of data. They have all kinds of data about, numbers of soldiers and their ages and wars over time, and yet most military historians were not digitally savvy at all. As a discipline, she was concerned that a lot of her peers had no idea how to take advantage of new techniques for searching and analyzing military data for their work. So she helped us organize a special conference where we brought in about 50 military historians who did not know anything about how to use technology for the research. And we gave them 3 days of sort of intense training on a number of new methods that they can use hands-on. It was very hands-on, showing them how they could take their data that they are looking at today and use these new digital technologies. And I'll tell you, so many of the professors contacted me afterwards and told me that it really opened their eyes, that they did not know anything about digital humanities before, but now they're going to start taking advantage of some of the things that they learned in their work. So I think that training is absolutely essential. That's the number one thing. The number two thing is graduate training. I think we really need, every graduate student in the humanities takes methods classes of one kind or another. But in the United States, I'll be honest with you, most of these methods classes, they could have been taught 100 years ago. They don't really get into how to use Google for searching, for example, how to take advantage of network analysis or data mining or any of these new techniques. So I really think that at the graduate level, we need to start training professors on how to do digital research as well.
That's one of the interesting things, and Brett, you're aware of this, the session we had in Ottawa not that long ago with IBM is sort of instructive in this as well, is that they're putting some of their product, on the web and making it available for trial. So Watson, for example, you can use their digital interpretation tool for data sets just for free. And it's a bit like, this is not for publication, but it's a bit like, dog food commercials, and they sell you the dog, right? They're not selling you the food. You buy the dog, and you have to buy the food. I think they have an interest in selling services to researchers, and they're trying to get that on the street and give people a taste. It is really cool, what these programs can do. So that will help too, to some extent. We're good? Well, open access. Well, no, I was, taking questions on open access at any point. I'd be curious as to see what types of issues are being raised by humanists, or whether they're not really paying attention. Because in our case, we made a policy that was effective May 1st, 2015. It doesn't really affect anything for quite a while, because you have to be funded first, and then you have to have a publication, and in some cases it might be 2 or 3 years before anyone needs to even worry about putting an article in a repository.
But see, can you put it into any repository that you want, so long as the repository is open access? So you just take advantage of any of the open access repositories that are available?
That's true, as long as it's searchable and findable, yes.
Do we have any information about the comparative rating of open access journals and non-open access journals? Because one of the most important parts of promotion procedures is that they want to know how good the journal is,
Right.
so and so forth.
I'm going to say two things about this. First of all, as you know, we don't want to confound two issues here. I mean, good journals are good journals are good journals, whether they're online or they're not online, and we should know what the difference is between the two. And I think any open access policy, as a first order of business, tells researchers, publish where you need to publish, and publish in the best journals you can. Full stop. On the other hand, and it doesn't mean you must publish in an open access journal. You don't have to. Or an online journal. You don't have to. That may be one way to satisfy the requirement, but there's no obligation for you to do that. Apparently there is a list. Don't ask me what the website is, but it's a list of every bad end online journal that ever existed, and you can. It's a blacklist essentially, and you can go and find them. But if I'm a researcher, I'm going to know where to go or not to go. I'm going to publish in the best journals. End of story. That I can, until I get down the list. Yeah.
One question about open access. There are, apart from the gold and green and the narrow definition of open access, there are issues like the availability of data, whether so not just published freely, but also available for mining, for reusing, for and even linked data.
Yes.
So, do you have any policy measures in this regard?
Yes, currently the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and for some time now, has had a requirement that any article that's been published, the associated data must be published also in a repository. They were using MedPub, is that what it's called? PubMed and PubMed.
PubMed.
Right, exactly. So now for everything else, not yet. For the other agencies, not yet. So we've developed now a statement of principles on data management. So my agency and the Natural Science and Engineering Research Council and CIHR have a statement of principles, and we'll be launching a data management pilot early next year. So we'll require not just associated data, but that all data that's been obtained with public funding to be made available within some time period in some reasonable format. So we're just in process of working out what that's going to look like. That's been contentious, as well. There are 1,000 questions, but what we're saying is, and as in the case of open access, This is about ensuring good practice to make sure that the results of scholarship are made widely available. It's not a policing action. It's not just there to make your life miserable.
So, but in terms of databases, making databases available, what are the repositories that are available for people to deposit their databases?
Right now?
Yeah.
Well, I know of several, that certainly in the case of the researchers who worked in the Polar Year project, for example, all their data has been made available. The data that's coming out of CERN and the synchrotron has been made available. In the social sciences and humanities, there are fewer currently, but there are organizations, as I mentioned, like Scholars Portal, that already makes that available, and there are institutional repositories and institutions that already allow for that.
Academia EDU.
They do as well?
Academia EDU is very, very, very popular. It's where everyone uploads their own papers.
But do they upload data yet, though?
That's not databases. That's just.
I'm talking about research data. Yeah. Here again, I think the solution is going to be pretty piecemeal, and this, as I was saying before, there may be private sector solutions that come to play here also.
Just to give you another example for our long-term projects. So long-term projects, as I've outlined this morning, are projects we are funding of up to 12 years. And quite frequently we have there the editions of the works of, well, famous philosophers, theologians or whatsoever. And until recently, if you do an edition, you always have a contract already with the publisher. And the publisher has certain requirements. Yep. Now we have made it compulsory that if you want to be funded, you of course can have a hard copy publication, but you must have also a digital version available. Now we are still now struggling. What does it mean? Is it just having a PDF uploaded? Yeah. How is it if you have it also with a contract with the publisher when there is the data open access available? Because open access, it's another compulsory element with this kind of publication. So we are still struggling a bit, but for us it's the future, and it will come up. And well, finally, I think looking at my son at the age of 13, the way he handles data and all these programs, I'm quite optimistic.
Yeah.
It will just take some time.
No, I totally agree, and at the end of the day, we may be concerned, but we're not nervous. I mean, it's something to think about. Apparently, something like 75% of all journals now already have an open access alternative. For the ones that don't,
right.
And I think what we may find, and senior researchers are telling me, wagging their fingers, saying, this is bad because no one will publish now in the top journals because they charge too much and they won't let you put up your final version. Look, this is not the law of Toyland here. We're trying to encourage good behavior. If you confront that situation, then let us know. If your journal says under no circumstances can you publish this on a green route, and I need $3,000 from you, then tell me, and then we will waive the requirement, or we will wait until the journals do the right thing and allow this within a period of time. So it's an evolution. It's building towards good practice.
I would like to add some of the experiences we have at NWO with open access. NWO is one of the organizations that defends that chose the golden road, and of course in humanities there was some misconceptions about it and some objections towards it. So what we did in humanities is, for instance, giving a subsidy for the setting up of open access journals in areas where there were no journals yet. So in order to make it easier, that's one step that we did. Another one is about the monographs. There is an international project, it's called OAPEN, well, the only thing I know much about is OAPEN NL. I chaired the steering group of that, and one of the things we did in that project was to make a lot of monographs open access accessible, but to compare them with another set of comparable books to try to find out how you can come to a sustainable business model for the publication of open access monographs. So that was another thing, because you need the publishers. One of the biggest objections in humanities is that publishers are part of the academic system,
Yes, that's
in
right.
fact, and that they give added value to a publication. It's just not the simple text. It's more what they do. So what we try to do is to try to find different ways of attacking the objections by making things possible and learning things.
Absolutely. Are we at time?
No, we still have some minutes, but we can also adjourn.
No, I wasn't suggesting we needed to. I just wondered. Are there other questions? Or?
This very common problem of accreditation that doesn't really follow the open access policy of funders. So, for example, the ISF here did, I think, even require that some data would be made available, textual data. I think it was a synoptical edition, and then the same synoptical edition would not accredit the scholar in her committee, accreditation committee at her institution. It's just this one story, Do you have any ideas about how to make those two advancements to go together, the one in accreditation and the one in funding and
Yeah,
open
so
access?
I'm not quite following you though in terms of accreditation for what?
For promotion,
okay.
for
Well, I
promotion, yeah.
Yeah, so and I hear this quite often. In fact, I have a letter, sitting in my inbox right now from someone who's saying, this is the worst thing you've ever done. Everybody knows that only paper journals will get you promoted and get you tenure. Saying, well, and that all online journals are not worthy of the electricity, required. What I have to explain is that you're not. That this isn't what this is about. You always publish where you need to publish. You always do what you need to do. All we're saying is at the end of the day, once you've published within 12 months, please find a way to make this available, and that's it. Now, if you take the easy route, then you'd say, well, I'll just publish in an online journal. But if you take another route, that you need to take to support your career, then you may have an issue with respect to your ability to fulfill the policy. But if you do, then I want to know, because we're going to, as we were saying, we want to deal with these issues as they come up effectively, not in a way that's punitive. And I don't want anyone to take a route that's going to affect their career, it's going to make it more difficult to get promotion or tenure. I mean, that's not the purpose of any of this.
Maybe it should be punitive to the committees that deal with accreditation.
Yeah, well, those we don't control.
Well, but it says, you say it's an evolutionary process, and so it'll take, at a certain point, then the promotion committees will, get in line with the advance in the culture of academia.
Well, we hope so.
I'm sure it'll happen. I'm sure
Well,
it'll
these
happen.
are
It's
our
just-
colleagues.
Exactly,
so,
exactly, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Brett. Yeah, Brett. Thank you.